This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Corenna Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Corenna Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Now joining us in studio is Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. This is great.
Yes, thanks for coming in. We know that you're busy, that's for sure.
A few things going on.
Yeah, I bet.
You've been quite active in federal litigation alongside other attorneys general. What goes into building these coalitions, and how do you decide which national issues warrant Maine's legal involvement?
There is a tremendous amount of cooperation, nonpartisan cooperation between my office and other attorneys general offices across the United States and territories. And we are regularly in touch about different issues that impact consumers across the nation. And so when there is an issue that's impacting Mainers, and we see this impact happening in other states, as the state's different chief legal officers, we work together to figure out how to address that harm. So usually it's going to be a national actor that's in play, where you'd have multiple states getting on board to bring a coalition. So you've seen it, for example, with opioids and going after those manufacturers, distributors of opioids that fuel the opioid crisis. You see it in different consumer protection actions. Maybe there's a data breach. Maybe there's some anti-competitive behavior by a business. We as state attorneys general our offices will work together. We'll figure out if we have a case that we can bring, and we'll bring it. There are other times where maybe a harm is focused on Maine. Maybe this is something that is unique to Maine, and maybe other states' attorneys general, their offices will have some expertise that they will help us with to help bring a case, or we will bring the case on our own to represent the interests of Maine citizens. Because regardless of whether or not the harm is national or state focused, it is the job of the Attorney General for the state of Maine to be looking after the interests of the state, and when necessary, when it makes sense to address a harm, to bring litigation or to defend litigation. That's the other thing that my office does probably more than anything else, which is, provide advice to different state agencies on what their obligations are, on what the law requires of them, on how to deal with different issues that they might have that require legal advice. And then, if the state gets sued or if the state has to take an enforcement action against a bad actor, that's where the Attorney General's office is going to come in. I have joined with some other attorneys general on a number of different issues in which the federal government has made some decisions that, in my assessment, in the assessment of some other attorneys general, were inconsistent with what the law required. So Congress makes the law. It's up to the president to enforce the law. And whenever there's some dispute about whether or not the law is being followed or the state is getting what it should get, what it was promised by Congress, we can say that. But what happens is we go to court. We go to the judicial branch, which is the third branch of government, to have these issues resolved when we think that something that the president should be doing or that Congress has promised, we go to court to get relief. So even when we're successful, we're still challenged by what it does to the psyche, what it does to the ripple effects of the lack of confidence about what Congress has passed for law being followed. So that's why there's a lot of cases out there. There's only a handful that Maine is on. When you look at, there's like 300 or so cases that have been filed against the federal government since January. Maine is only involved in a small number because I'm only going to join a case as Maine's Attorney General if Maine is going to be harmed. And if Maine's not going to be harmed, then, there's really no business that I would have committing Maine to litigation.
Critics sometimes question the cost of these multi-state suits. How do you measure the return on these legal actions for Maine residents?
I actually appreciate the opportunity to clear that up, because Maine is not spending any more or saving money by not joining the litigation that I think folks are most concerned about, right? So when I've joined Maine to cases involving the Department of Education or different grants that should be flowing through the Department of Health and Human Services, or even when I joined Maine to the birthright citizenship suit, where the president had said that the 14th Amendment was no longer going to recognize citizenship for somebody born in the United States if they were born to parents who did not have certain documentation here, which was inconsistent with 150 years worth of law. By bringing those cases, these are attorneys who are already in my office. Their job is to look out for the legal interests of the state and look out for the overall citizen interest here in the state. And by the way, the reason we bring litigation for the most part is to ensure that Maine is receiving the benefit of what the law required. So even though it doesn't cost us more to bring this litigation. If Maine didn't join this litigation, we might not get, for example, the $91 million that was interfered with when the National Institutes of Health grants were blocked from coming in. Maine joined suit, got a preliminary order, got an order up front that said, no, don't stop that flow of money. So the money continued to flow into Maine. For that case, the cost actually would have been if Maine did not join suit. So right now, at least for the cases in which we're bringing against the federal government for what we allege is the law not being followed, there's no additional taxpayer cost to this. This is just really talented attorneys in my office. Nonpartisan, by the way. That's actually one of the things I want to highlight about the Office of the Attorney General. The way in which Maine's Attorney General is elected is by the legislature. It's the only state that elects it that way. And different from those offices where you have a direct election, most of the people that are working in Maine's Attorney General's office, they've been there for years and years and years. They served under multiple attorneys general here in Maine. You know, we had a Republican Attorney General in 2010 to 12. Some of the same people that worked for, a Democratic Attorney General worked for a Republican Attorney General, worked for a Democratic Attorney General. The advice is nonpartisan advice. So they're all working really hard. And what they're doing is they're helping preserve the continued flow of funding that Maine was promised by Congress into the state. So I appreciate that folks are thinking about how it is that we're structuring our work and how we're making sure that we're not turning this into a partisan fight or that we're not turning this into some sort of effort just to stymie the administration. I hope if, for folks looking at the work that we're doing, they'll see we got really talented people doing some great work to ensure that the funding and grants and resources that we were promised continue to flow into Maine, which would be a real cost if Maine did not have that congressionally directed funding coming in.
Speaking about being officers, what do you think about the bill where you would have had to run for that office rather than being elected by the legislature?
That's right. The constitutional offices in Maine are elected directly by the legislature. And so that's the Attorney General, the Secretary of State, and the State Treasurer. There is a state auditor. That's a statutory position. We consider it a constitutional, but that's also elected by the legislature. And for as long as probably anybody can remember, for as long as we've had the election by the legislature this way, there has been an effort to change that. And there's been a significant amount of interest to have the constitutional officers directly elected by the citizenry, which is the more majority way of doing it across the United States. Maine is the only state that elects their attorney general through the legislature. There are some other states that elect their secretary of state or the treasurer through the legislature. New Hampshire comes to mind, where I'm thinking the secretary of state's elected directly by the legislature. And there's a small number of states, 5, 6, 7, that are appointed by the governor. Their attorney general in particular, I'm not sure about the secretary of state or treasurer. So there have been bills, by and large, there's typically a conversation around the pros and cons. On the one hand, it's a way in which to develop a bench, regardless of the political background, right? So you have, Democrats, Republicans, unenrolleds able to run, raise some money, demonstrate their credibility, create a direct line through the citizenry, through the people that they represent in terms of where they draw their clear authority from. It also means there'd be a lot more money in politics. There'd be at least 3 if you just do the treasurer, attorney general, and secretary of state. If you had the auditor, 4 offices in which they'd be raising money every so many years. If it'd be every 4 years, that's one thing. Vermont actually elects their attorney general every 2 years. So you have a statewide election every 2 years. Right now, the legislature, it's comprised of the direct representatives of the people of Maine. You have 151 members of the State House. You have 35 members of the state Senate. They are all directly accountable to the people that elect them there, and they make decisions about what laws to pass, what laws to repeal, what laws to amend. And the extent to which the legislature has been identified as the way in which to elect the constitutional officers who are responsible for ensuring that the law is followed and to provide advice on, what's going on in the state and to take care of some of the state's most important business. I can understand why there might be some value for folks to maintain the legislature and it's every 2 years, by the way. So to the extent that that creates an opportunity every 2 years for the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Treasurer, to come forward and explain why they should continue to do the work, it really is an accountability measure that might be lost if you change to a 4-year cycle. That's not me taking a position. That's just sort of exploring that there's different ways to look at it. And, and I can understand that, in terms of the accountability to the legislature, accountability to a governor, accountability to the people, there's some thought that maybe there's a value in having the citizens elect that person. Again, I think citizens are well represented by the legislature and by members of the legislature. And by the way, it also separates it from the governor. So it also creates that insulation, allowing an independence for the constitutional offices from the second branch of government, which, again, there might be some value when you think about the work that these different offices are supposed to do and how it is that they may be able to take positions without worrying that they're going to, make the governor mad, or even if they make a member of the legislature mad or a couple members of the legislature. There's accountability, but with the freedom to exercise the constitutional powers that are entrusted to these offices.
Do you actually answer to the legislature? How does that work?
Not exactly. I mean, yes and no. I answer to the people of Maine to the extent that when I am making decisions, when I'm thinking about, what is in the best interest of the state, when I provide advice to agencies, when I provide advice to the legislature, when I take positions in litigation, I'm thinking about what's in the best interest of the state and what's in the best interest of the people of Maine. I do pay fair attention to what's going on in the legislature. I want to make sure they're getting the advice that they need and deserve to make decisions that they need to make that impact Mainers and impact the business of the state. I do believe that, me personally, I am probably more attentive to the legislature as someone who's been elected by the legislature than I might be if I was not directly elected by the legislature, because not only do I see the work of the legislature and of the governor to be very important, but I recognize that every 2 years I'm going to be making my case for why I should continue to be in this job. And I want to make sure that I've been attentive in that way. But does it make me any more influenced or uninfluenced? I think I just pay a little bit closer attention than I might otherwise. But recognizing that at the end of the day, my decision making on how I commit Maine's resources, represent Maine in court, represent Maine's legal interests, it really has to be about what makes the most sense for Maine. I think that's what the legislature would want to hear from their attorney general, because again, they pass the laws, they repeal the laws, they amend the laws. It's my job as Maine's chief legal officer to make sure that life is given to that law that they're passing. That's really where my focus is.
If you're just tuning in, this is Q Point Podcast. I'm Corenna Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey. Let's talk about a recent headline that stated litigation over the censure between the AG's office and Laurel Libby is now moot. Can you expand on that?
Sure. So at this point, this case was in the First Circuit, which is the appellate court. So the way your federal court system works, you have the federal district court here in Maine, in the state of Maine. This is the first court where you start, and then whatever decision's made there, maybe you take issue with it, so you appeal it to another court, and that would go to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's located in Boston. And then if you don't like the decision at the First Circuit, then you can ask the Supreme Court to review it. And maybe they will, maybe they won't. In this case, what had happened is we had a judgment, we had a certain decision at the federal court level that Representative Libby was concerned with. It was appealed to the First Circuit, and the First Circuit made a decision that Representative Libby was concerned with. And then it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did decide to weigh in and basically provide some relief that Representative Libby had asked for. So at that point, it came back to the First Circuit to get sorted out. After that happened, the Maine House did rescind the restrictions that had been placed on Representative Libby. And both my office and Representative Libby, through her attorney, recognized that because the restrictions on her were rescinded, that the appeal in the First Circuit was no longer necessary to keep going. So at least for the First Circuit considerations, the agreement was that there was nothing further to be dealing with right now at the appeal court.
Which can always change.
It shouldn't change relating to the restrictions. So one of the things that was, I think, made very public was when these restrictions were rescinded by the House, the Speaker of the House, who's the presiding officer, indicated that he had no intent of permitting some effort to reinstitute the restrictions that had been placed on Representative Libby for the same conduct. If any representative were to go out and do something else, right, then the rules that are in place and the ability for the House to censure and impose restrictions for prospective activity, that's still there. But for the conduct that was involved in this litigation, the reason the censure was issued in the first place, Speaker Fecteau made it clear that he was going to rule out of order any effort to try to reinstitute the restrictions based on that prior conduct.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, so that's why there was agreement about this being moot at the appellate court level, because if there had been some risk that the House could reinstitute the restrictions for the same conduct, then if I were counsel for Representative Libby, I would have expected that I'd want to litigate this to make sure that the House couldn't reinstitute. But when the Speaker made it clear that he was not going to be entertaining any motion to reinstitute those restrictions based on that same conduct. Again, if any representative goes out tomorrow and does something that the House believes is worthy of censure, That's the prerogative of the House.
Right.
Same with the Senate. If a senator goes out and does something, the way the rules work for these chambers is that there's a certain decorum, a certain expectation that members of these chambers act in a certain way. These are rules that have in some form been substantively in place since 1820 when our state was first established, right? Maybe the words were a little bit different, maybe a little bit more old-timey than they are now, right? But it was the same idea. And so there's always been a certain ability for the House, for the Senate to hold their members to maybe a higher standard than what, you expect somebody in the street corner shouting at people to be. So that's still there. But going back to the question, what was made clear here is that the Speaker was not going to entertain some effort to reinstitute the restrictions for the behavior that already happened. So that's what led to the agreement that, at least for the appellate court proceedings, there was really nothing more to talk about and the case was moved.
So what's a typical day in the AG's office?
Well, as you might guess, it's varied. The state's attorney general, we are responsible for all the legal matters that the state has, right? So we provide advice to the different branches of government. We provide advice to agencies, boards, commissions. We provide advice to different state actors. And that advice varies. It's usually just day-to-day advice to make sure that, they're able to fulfill their function, do their job, make sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to do when, there's some program that they're making sure is run right. My office, we have about 250 people that are attorneys and non-attorneys. They do a broad range of work that goes to prosecuting homicide cases and big drug cases. It involves defending the state when we're sued over any number of different issues. We provide advice to the Department of Health and Human Services on not only very important programs that help ensure health care and, certain entitlement programs are being administered in the state, but also in child protective cases and child support cases. We have assistant attorneys general who are working hard to represent the clients and protect children and ensure that the money that is needed for a child is coming in through the non-custodial parent. We represent natural resources agencies. So when you have like the Department of Environmental Protection or Department of Agriculture, we're helping represent them and making sure their programming is going well. Or if there's some offender, maybe somebody is an oil spill that has created some issue or some toxic creation of sorts that has been deposited, we'll represent in a court these different agencies. So a broad range of work. Like I mentioned, we have a number of attorneys and non-attorneys. They all do really, really good work. And it's across the state. So we will have an attorney in probably every single district court across the state, superior court across the state. At any given time, we have a few different regional offices. So an office in Portland, an office in Bangor, an office in Caribou. The main office, of course, being in Augusta, where most of the attorneys and non-attorneys are housed. And then as for me, I have the benefit of working with a lot of talent. And so there might be different decisions that have to be made about how we're going to defend a case, whether or not to bring a case, making sure we have the right talent that's coming in. So if we have people who move on or retire from time to time, and we need to find the right people to ensure that the state's interests are being represented, because that really is at the top of everybody's mind in my office, which is how do we make sure that we're serving the people and state of Maine? So that takes up some work. There's some issues that, particularly for the Attorney General, whether it be high-level litigation against corporations or use of deadly force by law enforcement, these are the types of decisions that I get directly involved in, as well as working a little bit earlier in the program. We talked about how I work with other attorneys general across the United States on a number of different issues, whether it be protecting consumers or whether it be dealing with different issues that come up with certain federal enforcement. That involves my time too. There'll be, I'll have a number of calls with different colleagues across the United States about work that we're doing together and work we're considering doing together and work that we just don't think we should be doing together. A typical day could look different. So I guess a typical day is not typical, but it does involve a lot of work to make sure that the people of Maine, that the state of Maine is getting the legal services that they deserve and protecting them where they need protecting, whether it be through defending a state agency or a state actor in court or bringing a case that requires being brought to protect a certain state interest.
Can you shed any light on the backlog within the Maine judicial system and the challenges surrounding unrepresented defendants?
I think what I can shed light on is that really going back to the pandemic, it has just been hard for the court to catch up, not just with criminal defense. I mean, I think with criminal defense, that's really the most acute concern because you have individuals who are charged with crimes, who may be under bail conditions, who may be sitting in jail waiting either for their case to be heard or to get an attorney because, there has been concerns with being able to connect public defenders or those who do public defense up with individuals who are waiting for their constitutionally required counsel, right? But we do see some pressure on the civil docket as well. So it's not just criminal, it's civil. I mentioned earlier that we do child protective cases where we represent the state in court when there's a concern about the well-being of a child and how that relationship is working with their parents. Child support, and when we're making sure that the resources are there for a child and their upbringing. There's been a bit of a backlog and it's sort of hard to get hearing time, hard to get time to move cases across the board. And in many ways, it's probably just a continued challenge in how the court is able to manage its docket, how different decisions that are made by prosecutors, decisions that are made by defendants about how to deal with cases, it all adds up. Hopefully, I'm not pointing a finger at any particular place other than it just seems like we've been trying to catch up. I think the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, she talked about this in her State of the Judiciary speech a number of months ago, back, I think it was February, that she addressed a joint convention of the Maine legislature, talking about how just sort of getting people through has been challenging because of they might not have clerks, they might not have marshals, so it makes it hard to have court time. And again, prosecutors make whatever decisions they make that contribute to how long a case lasts or doesn't last. Defendants make whatever decisions they're going to make about whether or not to deal with their case one way or the other, and that may lead to a need for certain time that the court doesn't have to move the case. So at this point, I know the legislature has been working really hard to try to get at the representation side, the criminal representation side, and to a lesser extent, not as visible, but from my office's standpoint, equally concerning is access to parents' counsel. So in a child protective case, parents who can't afford an attorney because their parent-child relationship is being interfered with, that's a constitutionally protected relationship, they are also entitled to counsel under the Constitution. And so there's been some challenges in some particular parts of the state in ensuring that there's adequate access to counsel. And so I know that there are folks working hard on this. There is litigation. Can't really get into sort of how that's moving. I think there's been a lot of publicity on that anyway that would help the listeners understand some of the different moving parts. That's probably the best sense I have without... Now, they don't let me in court, as you might guess, right? I say that. I suppose if I really wanted to go to court, I could go in. But I used to practice for 10 years before I was Attorney General. I had my own practice
right
here in Bangor.
In town. Yeah,
right in Bangor. And I did criminal defense. Public defense, really. I mean, I took indigent clients on the criminal side, and I also did parents' work in child protective cases. So probably 97% of my work was indigent legal work. And so I was in court day in and day out in Bangor and Newport. Every now and then I'd get over to Ellsworth or I'd get over to Dover-Foxcroft. Very rarely I would get up into never to Millinocket. I never had a case that was heard in Millinocket court, but I would get up to Lincoln. And so, I sort of had a sense at that time as to what some of the different pressures were. But having been out of court for 7 years and asking and hearing about what has been going on in court from some of my, the folks I used to sit in court with, it's just my understanding that there's a lot of different pressures, a lot of different decisions that are and a challenge of finding people to do the work that we really need to have done. So what's unfortunate, and I do recognize this, is that the people that I was representing as court-assigned counsel, I recognize that the people whose eyes I was looking in doesn't have somebody on the other side of that table to look into the eyes and try to help them get through what is probably one of the more challenging times in their life. Usually if you were in my office, it was not because things were going well, right? Because at least the kind of work I was doing. So I'm encouraged that the legislature has been working on this. I know that the Maine Commission for Public Defense Services has been working on this. I think bringing the public defender's offices online is providing some relief. There was some recent reporting, in fact, about the office here in Bangor in which their presence had helped to ensure that more individuals were getting access to counsel than perhaps there had been for backlog purposes. I think there are a lot of people who are working really hard to address the pressures on the system. If I had the answer, though, I feel like I'd be in high commodity.
You certainly would.
I could write a book and make a business of it. I mean, certainly don't mean to joke about it, but I think there are a lot of smart people who are thinking about this and just trying to figure out a way forward while you have people who are waiting in jail or parents who are waiting for attorneys or a couple who's waiting for maybe an adoption to take place or a divorce to take place or a landlord's waiting for their landlord-tenant case to get in. So, I mean, it's affecting just across the board civil, criminal. If there was anybody who knew what the answers were, I think we would have heard them by now. And so I think a lot of people are just working really hard to attack that backlog and get us back to a more even keel.
We have had some guests on here that talked about the public defender's office, and they said that, that has been a positive for certain in Bangor.
Bangor, Augusta, Lewiston, Auburn. I'm not sure if one's been brought online in Portland yet. The discussion about a public defender's office had been out there for years. When I was in the legislature, there was some discussion about it. There just wasn't a really clear plan on how to bring it online. But fortunately, because what was the Maine Commission on Indigent Legal Services, now the Maine Commission for Public Defense Services, there was a lot of thinking about how to make this work. The legislature did provide the resources, and of course the governor had agreed with some resources to get these set up. And I do think that as they are coming online, I think it's expected that they take about 33% of the volume of cases that are in whatever district they're in. And I think what we're seeing is that sort of having something stable does have the promise of being a helpful contribution. Again, once they get set up, I mean, just like anything else, they had to find office space, get internet set up. And I know early on, as I had understood what had been communicated to me by some of those who were working in these offices, it just took a little bit to sort of get set up, find the right people who were going to do the work, and then sort of figure out how to get the cases coming in a way that made sense for providing the quality legal representation that they needed. But going back to the question, yeah, I do think that the public defender's offices are demonstrating that they're going to play an important role in ensuring access to meaningful counsel for so many people across the state.
You've been listening to Part 1 with Maine Attorney General Aaron Frey. Be sure to tune in to Part 2 tomorrow, Sunday, July 27th on VOM, the Voice of Maine. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.